More than 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, F-16 Fighting Falcons have officially begun arriving in country, marking what many hope will be a shift in the embattled nation's air defense and air support capabilities. These Western fighters represent what promises to be a significant increase in combat capability for the Ukrainian Air Force. But despite the potential these aircraft have to tip the balance of conflict in Ukraine's favor, it's also important to keep in mind that the war for Ukraine's future is much too large to be decided by any one aircraft. So let's try to cut through all the hyperbole surrounding Ukraine's new F-16s, determine what they really can offer the Ukrainian defense, but just as importantly, what they can't. Because while the legendary Viper can't win this war for Ukraine all on its own, it can definitely make Russia's hopes for victory a whole lot tougher to come by. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. With F-16s arriving in Ukraine, media coverage and online discourse is centered pretty squarely on these aircraft and what they might be able to do for the Ukrainian defense. And don't think for a minute that that reality is lost on the elements of the Russian government responsible for narrative management, disinformation, and of course, media manipulation. The fact of the matter is, Russia's well aware of the fact that Western governments are largely beholden to public perception. And as such, if they can shape that public perception in such a way as to make it seem like providing this support to Ukraine isn't worth it, well, then they stand a pretty good chance at ending those supply lines. And that's why tools like ground news are so valuable in today's media space. Ground news makes it easy to stay on top of what's going on in the world while also poking through the veil of media bias and disinformation that's so commonplace online today. And it does that by aggregating news articles published by outlets all over the world and then placing them into a single easy-to-read feed. For every story you find on ground news, they'll give you the context you need about that outlet's political affiliations, its ownership, and its reliability in reporting. Not to mention making it very easy to see how headlines can sometimes differ pretty significantly depending on an outlet's political leaning. In fact, we can use this F-16 story as an example. Right here on Ground News, we can see that 267 news outlets have already reported on F-16s arriving in Ukraine, including at least 45 left-leaning outlets, 32 right-leaning ones, and at least 66 centrist ones. And if you scroll down just below the headline and story summary provided by Ground News, you can also choose political affiliations to compare their headlines. In this case, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between how left-leaning and right-leaning outlets have covered the story, at least in terms of word choice. But that's not the case for every story, and that's why one of the tools I love on Ground News is their blind spot feature. This page gives you a list of stories that are getting a great deal of coverage on one side of the political sphere and getting the silent treatment on the other. After all, media bias isn't just about how you present a story, it's also about which stories you choose to present. And that's just one of the many reasons that I'm a big fan of Ground News, not just for my research, but for my day-to-day news consumption. And I bet you will be too, and I can get you a great deal. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off that Vantage plan that helps you stay on top of things. Earlier this week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky issued a statement from an undisclosed location somewhere inside Ukraine. Standing in front of one of the nation's new F-16s, he announced to the world that these Western fighters had finally reached his nation, going on to express his gratitude to the laundry list of nations responsible for providing these aircraft, the training required for its pilots and maintainers, the logistical support, and more, highlighting what a massive undertaking it's been to get these Western fighters into Ukrainian hands. I'll quote Zelensky here. I wish our Air Force and all our warriors to feel the pride of Ukrainians in our combat aviation and bring Ukraine the combat results that will bring our victory closer. Our just peace for Ukraine. Now, I've said several times now that we need to keep our expectations about what these F-16s can do for Ukraine grounded in reality. But I also want to highlight that being realistic and even pragmatic about what we hope to see out of these aircraft isn't the same as being pessimistic, because while Ukraine's new F-16s were built more than 4 decades ago and have since been updated and upgraded to be more or less technologically on par with the F-16s America flew throughout 1991's Operation Desert Storm, there is a reason why the F-16 is the most widely operated 4th-generation fighter on the planet today, with more than 4,600 airframes produced to date, and at least 2,100 F-16s still in active service in the air forces of 25 different nations. This aircraft is so nimble, so agile, and so broadly capable that it remains one of the most potent multi-role fighters ever to see the skies above this planet. And after more than 2 years of Ukrainian pilots having to fight uphill against a nation with massive numerical and technological advantages in the sky, these aviators are finally going to have the hardware they need to go on the offensive. And while a few dozen, or even 60 or 80 F-16s might not be enough to secure air superiority over the entirety of Ukrainian airspace, these aircraft nonetheless have the chops to have a significant impact on the way the rest of this conflict plays out. But again, in the midst of this conflict that includes global disinformation, propaganda, and narrative warfare campaigns, it's essential for us to remember that it could take years for the full breadth of F-16 capabilities to truly be brought to bear in this conflict. And of course, that losses are inevitable. That's not because the F-16 isn't a good aircraft, but rather because it's an aircraft. And no fighter's invincible. So before I delve deeper into the nuts and bolts of this topic, I want to make a prediction that the first time an F-16 is confirmed lost in Ukraine, whether in the air or on the ground, we will see a flood of news articles published by Kremlin-backed outlets and more sensational Western ones asking if the F-16 is overrated, if it's not actually all it was cracked up to be, because after all, if an aircraft is lost in combat, it must actually not be that good. Or at least that is a common sentiment you'll already find all over the comment sections under videos like this, all over Reddit and TikTok and Twitter and anywhere else armchair experts gather to convince each other that they know what they're talking about. Mark my words, there will be people claiming with a straight face that a few F-16 airframes lost in Ukraine is somehow indicative of broader systemic issues with the aircraft or how it's being employed, despite the fact that by April of this year, Russia had already lost 10% of its entire aircraft inventory in this fight, despite the fact that legendary aircraft like the F-15 Eagle, famous for its undefeated air combat record of 104 wins and 0 losses, has been shot down by surface-to-air missiles in combat. The combination of the advent of stealth, followed by more than 2 decades of asymmetric conflict against adversaries with no appreciable air defenses to speak of, has skewed our perspective of how fighter aircraft actually operate, and of what happens when you wage war at this scale. The F-16 is not a stealth fighter. It won't be prowling undetected throughout the contested airspaces of Ukraine. If anything, I would liken the F-16 to the New England Patriots offense back in Tom Brady's heyday, when everybody could see what was coming from a mile away. Brady's gonna dump a high percentage pass into the flats, but they executed so effectively that you couldn't stop them, even when you knew the play. So with the finer points of the narrative warfare to come addressed, let's talk about the weapon systems these aircraft will leverage on behalf of Ukraine, starting in the air-to-air realm. In images and video released by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and the Office of the President of Ukraine this week, F-16s were shown armed with air-to-air focused loadouts, comprised of AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and AIM-9 Sidewinder infrared-guided short-range air-to-air weapons. Now, the AIM-120, which serves as America's primary beyond visual range air-to-air missile, comes in multiple forms, including the AIM-120C, which is really optimized for internal carriage in stealth fighters like the F-35, and the AIM-120D, which is the most capable iteration of this missile to reach service, and among the most capable air-to-air missiles in the world today. The AIM-120D boasts GPS guidance, anti-jam capabilities, and a maximum engagement range that extends out beyond 110 miles. Though it's not entirely clear which version or versions of the AMRAAM Ukraine will be flying on these jets. In at least some of the images released this week, it sure looks like those F-16s were flying with inert AIM-120B, or Bravo versions of the weapon, an iteration that entered service in the mid-1990s and offers significantly less range than the latest and greatest AIM-120D or Delta variants. Though in the past, Ukrainian officials have stated plainly that the version of the AMRAAMs they're receiving have a range in excess of 100 miles, which points very strictly to the AIM-120 Delta or D. But again, statements made by politicians like inert training missiles on an aircraft at a PR event are not necessarily evidence of the weapons that will actually be carried into the fight, so at least for now, the AMRAAM question is still a bit murky. But to be clear, regardless of which AMRAAM Ukraine's F-16s fly with, it will represent a significant improvement over the R-27 semi-active radar-guided air-to-air missiles employed by Ukrainian fighter jets today. The R-27 has a maximum range of just over 60 miles in the best of conditions, but it's much more difficult to employ against enemy fighters due to its lack of onboard radar guidance. Unlike the AMRAAM, which can transition to its own onboard radar seeker as it approaches its target to close the remaining distance unassisted, Ukraine's R-27s require continued guidance from the fighter's onboard radar. This means Ukrainian pilots attempting long-range engagements need to chase the missiles they launch, maintaining a lock on their targets until the missile makes impact. And this was actually touched upon briefly by Colonel Yuri Belavka, a Ukrainian Su-27 pilot, in an interview he did this past April when asked why Ukraine needs Western fighters so badly. He said, and I quote, "After all, these aircraft have powerful onboard radars, technological equipment, and most importantly, missiles with active homing heads." Now, Russian forces have been attempting extremely long-range engagements against Ukrainian fighters using their R-37M radar-guided missiles launched at high altitude by MiG-31BMs, which have a claimed maximum range of around 250 miles. Though in practice, Russian aircraft have primarily been employing these missiles from inside of 80 miles, outside the reach of Ukraine's R-27s, but well within the reach of AIM-120Ds if that is indeed what Ukraine receives. Though targeting at that range with the radars carried inside these dated F-16s, the AN/APG-66V2 would be quite the challenge. Now, the next air-to-air missile we can see prominently on display here is the AIM-9M Sidewinder, which is not as advanced or capable as the latest variant of the Sidewinder, known as the AIM-9X, but is nonetheless seen as an extremely potent short-range weapon. The AIM-9M uses a traditional infrared seeker and control surfaces, and is limited to engaging targets within the pilot's forward field of view, as opposed to the AIM-9X's high off-bore sight targeting capability that famously allows it to engage enemy fighters even when they're flying directly behind the launching aircraft. Like much of the technology found within the F-16AMs being employed by Ukraine, the AIM-9M was cutting edge in the early 1990s, being credited with at least 10 air-to-air kills in Operation Desert Storm alone, but does remain a far cry from the latest and greatest munitions you might find on American fighters today. But like the AMRAAM, there is still some murky water here, because a Wall Street Journal report came out saying that Ukraine will indeed be receiving AIM-9X variants of the Sidewinder missile, which will dramatically increase the close quarters combat capabilities of these F-16s. Now, the AIM-9X not only boasts a significantly improved guidance system to better see through the tricks of common missile countermeasures like flares, but it also offers a massive increase in aerobatic maneuverability. According to at least some sources, the AIM-9X's thrust vectoring rocket nozzle and reinforced fuselage allow this weapon to perform 60G maneuvers. Now that, in conjunction with the helmet-cued targeting systems we've seen Ukrainian F-16 pilots already leverage, mean these aviators will not need to point the nose of their aircraft at an enemy fighter in order to lock on and fire, and instead can lock on to adversary aircraft using nothing more than their line of sight. Now, both the AMRAAM and Sidewinder in various iterations will prove valuable not just for air-to-air combat, they'll also be essential for expanding Ukraine's air defense capabilities. Both AMRAAMs and Sidewinders are capable of downing long-range subsonic cruise missiles like Russia's air-launched KH-101. And while the AIM-9X might be the Simone Biles of air-to-air missiles, the older AIM-9M is actually a very cost-effective option for engaging large enemy drones and other kinds of cruise missiles, rather than using much more expensive Patriot interceptors to bring them down. Alright, so now we know a bit about the air-to-air loadout. What about the air-to-ground loadout? Obviously, one of the most important air-to-ground munitions these F-16s will leverage is America's AGM-88 HARM, or High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile. Now, Ukrainian forces have already been using the HARM since August of 2022, or maybe even earlier, but because these weapons were being launched by dated Soviet jets that were never intended to use them, their utility has been dramatically limited. Now, anti-radiation missiles like the HARM work by homing in on the electromagnetic radiation, or radar waves, broadcast by surface-to-air missile radar arrays, making them uniquely suited for the suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses. American Wild Weasel pilots, which is what the Air Force calls aviators tasked with this job, often fly their aircraft into contested airspace, waiting for enemy air defense systems to power up in an attempt to target them or their wingmen. Once those air defenses are broadcasting radar waves, Wild Weasel pilots launch their HARM missiles to hone in on those radar waves and destroy the air defense equipment. Ukraine's Soviet-era fighters are only able to leverage the HARM missile in what many call the pre-briefed mode. In effect, the missile is pre-programmed with a target area and then launched by an aircraft, often at fairly long range. The missile flies towards its intended target area, using its onboard seeker to look for any air defense systems powering up and broadcasting radar waves for it to then close with and destroy. This method can be very effective, especially when launching these missiles in volume, as even if they don't ultimately destroy enemy radar sites, their presence alone will often prompt air defense crews to power down their arrays, which effectively amounts to suppressing air defenses, as those powered down arrays allow aircraft to operate inside that contested area, for a short time anyway. But of course, once the HARM threat has passed, those arrays power back up and begin hunting for Ukrainian jets all over again. However, if operated by an aircraft carrying NATO standard buses, like Ukraine's new F-16s, pilots can leverage the HARM's full capability set, including 2 more operational modes that can come in pretty handy in a fight. Those are Self-Protect mode and Target of Opportunity mode. Now, in self-protect mode, the aircraft's onboard radar warning receiver identifies an enemy radar array that's broadcasting. It then passes that target data over to the HARM, which can home in on either the broadcasting radar or the specific location that waves were coming from in the event the enemy powers the system down. The target of opportunity mode is similar, but sort of backwards. It has the AGM-88's onboard seeker active and looking for enemy radar arrays powering up for the weapon to then alert the pilot that it's got a target and wants to be launched. Another very important weapon system we can expect to see these F-16s carry is the extended range iteration of America's long-serving Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM. Now, JDAM kits are effectively guidance systems that can be installed on good old-fashioned dumb bombs to turn them into GPS-guided precision munitions. Now, usually these JDAMs are capable of engaging targets from ranges of about 15 miles out, but in February of 2023, the US announced its plan to give Ukraine the JDAM ER kits, which add deployable wings to the system to triple its engagement range out to better than 45 miles. Now, Russian forces have seen a great deal of success in recent months using a very similar glide bomb system, meaning Ukraine should soon be able to give them a taste of their own medicine, at least in this regard. Now, obviously, there are many more weapon systems potentially in play with these F-16s. These are just some of the ones I'd expect to see leveraged sooner rather than later. But we've spent a lot of time now talking about the weapons these F-16s will carry, and not much time about the F-16s themselves. So let's talk about how they compare to those you might be accustomed to seeing operated by, say, the United States Air Force. Ukraine's new old F-16s are being transferred from the inventories of Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway. And while these aircraft do share the same design as America's in-service F-16s, the hardware and software found on board is often quite a bit more dated. These F-16s, known as F-16AMs and BMs, were built and delivered in the 1970s and into the early 1980s, before undergoing what's called a midlife update, or the MLU, in the early 2000s to bring them more or less on par with the Block 50 or 52 F-16Cs and Ds that the US flew during Operation Desert Storm back in 1991. Now, that MLU update came with a few very important changes to these aircraft that will play a significant role in how they're leveraged in Ukraine. One of the most important ones is the Texas Instruments Modular Mission Computer, or MMC, which, in conjunction with a cockpit refresh, helped to bring these 1970s hot rods into the digital age, making it possible to leverage a breadth of new weapons and auxiliary systems through an improved pilot interface. And while Ukraine's F-16s do lack the incredibly capable active electronically scanned array radar found in most of America's F-16s, they nonetheless carry an updated AN/APG-66V2 fire control radar, which is a medium-range pulse Doppler planar array that's said to offer a 25% improvement in detection range over the aircraft's original radar setup. Now, this system is capable of tracking up to 10 targets simultaneously while scanning the area, and offers what's commonly called a 6-on-6 AMRAAM capability, which means the radar can support long-range engagements of up to 6 targets at once using an onboard complement of AIM-120 radar-guided air-to-air missiles. The original AN/APG-66 was said to have a target detection range out beyond 90 miles, or around 150 kilometers, and the ability to track fighter-sized targets at ranges of roughly 35 or so miles, right around 60 kilometers. So with that claimed 25% improvement, that should push those ranges out to roughly 110 miles for detection and a bit north of 43 miles for targeting of fighters, though it should be noted that these are unclassified figures and should be taken with a hearty helping of salt. Now, Ukraine's F-16s appear to be equipped with Denmark's Pylon Integrated Dispensing System Plus, or PIDS Plus, and maybe even the Electronic Combat Integrated Pylon System Plus. These systems, which you can see in the images look sort of like weapon pylons with optical sensors, include integrated radar warning receivers to notify the pilot of nearby threats, and missile approach warning sensors to let the pilot know when trouble is en route. This will be of particular value in attack and air defense suppression missions, as the Su-25s employed by Ukraine to date don't even have radar warning receivers to speak of. As Ukrainian Su-25 pilot callsign Pumba said, and I quote, Our jets don't have a system to warn us about Russian missile launches. It's all visual based. If you see them, then you just try to escape by firing off heat traps and maneuvering. Depending on which versions of these systems are being used, those integrated pylon countermeasure suites can provide either additional flares and chaff to confuse inbound missiles or more advanced Northrop Grumman-sourced electronic warfare capabilities that can wreak havoc on radar-guided missiles as well as the radar arrays that employ them. Put simply, these are pretty modern F-16s with all the bells and whistles you might expect in such a fighter, at least one operated by a nation without top-tier funding for the latest and greatest gadgets, making them a significant threat to Russian aviators, but not necessarily the technological overmatch one might expect in an engagement between American F-16s and Russian fighters. And that brings us full circle all the way back around to managing expectations in the face of narrative warfare. Because in practical terms, Ukraine will soon be operating between 60 and 80 total F-16s, maybe even more, which is certainly a significant development. But it's still far from enough to offset the numerical advantage represented by Russia's fighter fleets. The F-16 is a highly survivable fighter, as demonstrated by its performance in conflicts like Operation Desert Storm, where one F-16 managed to dodge 6 incoming surface-to-air missiles in rapid succession without the use of countermeasures. But it's important to remember that Russia's S-300 and S-400 air defense systems are the most advanced these fighters have ever squared off against in modern warfare. The F-16 is not a stealth fighter, and as such, is still very vulnerable to being detected and targeted by Russian air defenses, just as the rest of Ukraine's fighters have been throughout this conflict. But more than that, Russia will be making it their business to engage and destroy as many F-16s as quickly as they can to limit the positive effect these fighters can have on Ukrainian morale and on Western support. Russia's emphasis on managing the perceptions of the world at large through concerted disinformation campaigns, tightly interwoven with real and manufactured news out of the battlefield, is sure to be working overtime to find ways to portray these F-16s as ineffectual or highly vulnerable, and that will almost certainly come with a heavy allocation of resources meant to down these jets for the sake of that narrative, and, of course, to minimize their actual strategic impact. These fighters are most vulnerable on the ground, meaning Russian airstrikes will be placing a large emphasis on not just destroying the jets, but runways and support facilities required to operate them. To put it simply, these aircraft will be operating with a big target on their back, and the nature of warfare all but assures that some of them are going to go down fighting, or likely be destroyed on their runways. These losses will be framed in the media as a massive development for the sake of driving clicks in the West and for the sake of driving narrative out of Russia. But, as I said, losing aircraft is just what happens in the warfighting business. In order to defang Russian disinformation campaigns, we need to understand that F-16s aren't going to win this war for Ukraine. But they could play a vital part in a broader strategy aimed at doing exactly that. But to use them effectively to that end, risk will be an inherent part of the job. So as these jets slowly start getting into the fight, it's important to maintain realistic perspective about what they are and what they can do. F-16s are mind-bending jets. They are absolutely incredible to see in action, but they're not invulnerable, especially when they're sitting on the tarmac. Now, I am well aware that there will be pro-Russian commenters under this video trying to pretend that my pragmatic realism in this regard is a new development, claiming that Western analysts are trying to hide their fear that NATO's super fighters might not be as invincible as we all once claimed. But let's not fall for that tired old narrative either. There is no such thing as an invincible fighter, or tank, or anything else for that matter. There are only tools, strategies, and the incredibly brave men and women tasked with employing the first for the sake of the second. Warfare is a dirty business, and while the F-16 won't end that for Ukraine, it sure as heck will equip them to fight just a little bit dirtier than they ever could before. And that's really what transferring these jets is all about. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.